Hello everyone, welcome, thanks for joining me. I'm going to be speaking a little bit now about early modern English literature, and this is our last lecture on the early modern period. So, before we jump into things, however, I want to clarify something, okay? There is a difference between early modern language and early modern literature, according to scholars in each field. Linguists say that the early modern English period lasted from about 1400 to 1500 to 1800. Scholars break that down into two periods. The first is the English Renaissance, and that starts in 1485, 1500, or 1509, depending on your perspective, and it ends at 1660. And then from 1660 to 1798, literary scholars have what they call the Restoration and 18th century period. Okay, so linguists put it together, literary scholars break it apart. For the sake of complying with linguistic standards, because this is a class that has a base in linguistic study, I'm going to put them together, but you should know that it goes against everything that I was taught in my 12 years of college. So it's going to hurt, because one of my specializations is Restoration and 18th century literature, and I know nothing about 1600 Renaissance literature, which I say is 1485 to 1660. So I'm crying on the inside, but I will persevere. So let's talk about innovations. We see a lot of innovations in the 16th and 17th and 18th century. The earliest form of the novel appears in the 16th and 17th century, and a more modern version of the novel that's going to look like the novel we know today appears in the 18th century. Drama boomed during this time period, and you have plays that are being performed on wagons based on Bible stories, to everything that the Globe produced, right? The Globe Theater. Sonnet and verse were written literally by the hundreds, and anyone with the ability to read and write could consider himself or herself a poet. We also see prose forms develop during this period, from the earliest version of the essay to scientific writings to political and religious treatises. The literacy rates grew exponentially in this period, partly because education was more readily available and partly because books were more affordable. The translation of continental texts also led to a period of philosophical and intellectual innovation among the literary elite in England. Plays were appreciated for their performance, but people also wanted copies of the works to read at home. In 1642, the Puritans closed the London theaters on moral grounds, because that was going to stop people. But drama then, it was still being written, it just wasn't being performed, and so now we see the birth of so-called closet drama. After the English Civil War, the restoration of the monarch happened in 1660. Mobile libraries developed, and for a subscription fee, you could have book loans delivered to your doorstep. So it was like a Netflix for books, I guess you can say. But with the rise of literacy and the demand for more things to read came the rise of pulp, or hack fiction. A great many novels, poems, and dramas were written at this time solely for financial gain, and some of the more established authors felt that it was their moral obligation to take these pretenders to task, right? So people, now that they could write, and now that they realized they could get money for writing, they did, even if it wasn't good. And then so the people who are writers for art's sake were like, you need to slow your roll. So then we get the rise of what's called literary criticism as we know it today, based off of all of this. In terms of influencers, in the majority of the texts on the history of the English language, scholars point out two big influencers. One, of course, is Shakespeare, and we can't get out of this period without talking about him. The other is the King James Version, also called the Authorized Version of the Bible. The third is going to be the English Civil War, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Let's focus on Shakespeare. So the theater as a whole had a tremendous impact on the social landscape. About 1/3 of the adult population around the time Shakespeare was writing attended the theater at least once per month. But there are many people who attended plays more frequently. Open air theaters, so theaters that were kind of outside, didn't discriminate according to class. If you could afford to enter the building, you were welcome. So we see peasants or groundlings paying a penny to stand and watch a 2-hour play. And at the same time, we see wealthier patrons paying more than a penny to sit in a cushy box, right? There was no discrimination. The crowd was welcome as long as you had money. The government itself considered theater to be instructive and required that all scripts be approved by a censor before being performed, lest they give the masses any dangerous ideas. And that's where the censorship I mentioned earlier came into play and all of this other stuff. Shakespeare's vocabulary is estimated at about 30,000 words, which is the largest of any English author, even those pillars who came after him, so like Milton and Pope. The Glossary and Language Companion, there's a book called Shakespeare's Words, and this book initially identified over 47,000 problematic items. I love it, problematic items, in Shakespeare's language, but they eventually narrowed it down to just over 21,000 entries worthy of discussion. So this doesn't mean that Shakespeare invented 21,000 words. He didn't. He used many existing words with different meanings than before. That's what he did. He recorded many existing words for the first time, and he drew from Latin, French, and older English sources and vocabulary. And so while he did invent as many as 2,200 words, his main kind of innovation was his playful approach to language, right? The way he played with language. It was his willingness to verb nouns and noun verbs, okay? He wasn't constrained by existing rules, and that's what made him kind of stand out from the rest. So, the English Civil War also had a big influence on the literature of that time. Okay, so, for years, Charles I maintained a strained relationship with Parliament because he wanted to rule unchecked, and Parliament was not going to allow that. So as a result, there arose a conflict between royalists, supporters of the king, and the opposition called Roundheads or Puritans. So in 1642, Charles I raised an army against Parliament, and Parliament's the government, and Parliament then decided, we're not going to let you do that, and so they had to take action against the king. So in 1649, 7 years later, Charles was beheaded, and England became a commonwealth for 11 years. And commonwealth just means there wasn't a monarch on the throne. The country was ruled by Parliament, by the government. Okay? So for 11 years. During this time, there wasn't much literary production as we think of it today. Most of the writing was nonfiction, prose, and it was very topical. So much of it wasn't included in anthologies. Okay? 1660, which is the rise of the Restoration period, when a monarch is restored to the throne, we see literature kind of pick back up again. Okay? During the Civil War, we also see a breakdown of censorship, which means writers can publish more controversial topics than before, including John Milton, who we're going to talk about later, who wrote a treatise on why divorce could be a good thing. Okay? So, speaking of Milton, let's talk about him. John Milton was born in Bread Street, Cheapside, the son of a well-to-do scrivener and composer, and a scrivener is a writer. His father was determined that his son should receive a thorough education. And so there are stories of the 12-year-old Milton working into the early hours of the morning. After attending St. Paul's School, Milton went on to Christ's College in Cambridge, and he got his MA in 1632. On leaving the university, he embarked on a tour of Europe, and then he settled with his father for a period of private study in Greek, Latin, and Italian. In 1641, he published a series of pamphlets against the bishops and went on to support the parliamentary cause in the Civil War. He was appointed Latin secretary to the Council of State under the Commonwealth. After the Restoration, though, so when the monarchy came back to the throne, well, for someone who was supporting the government so much, he had to go into hiding. But he was also arrested, fined, and then released. He was a learned author. He composed in Latin and Italian as well as English. The work that we most know him for is Paradise Lost. And that work has been the subject of criticism for its artificial language. Milton is indeed heavily influenced by his familiarity with Latin, but although he uses unusual word forms and unfamiliar senses, and although he exploits very long sentences with multiple embedded clauses, and although he shifts word classes, his language is less innovative than many Elizabethan authors. So, the second person we want to look at is Alexander Pope. He was born in London. He was the son of a linen importer and exporter, and he came from a Roman Catholic family, which at the time was very dangerous, so to speak. So this was an age when religious intolerance was rife. The young Alexander, his father, judged it prudent to move his family to Windsor Forest. As a Catholic, entry to the major educational establishments were out of the question, right? Like, he couldn't go to school because he was Catholic. So although Pope had 2 or 3 years of schooling in Catholic schools, he was largely self-educated. He seems to have been studious by nature, and this inclination to self-study was perhaps furthered by a serious illness that he had at the age of 12, which kind of stopped his growth and left him with lifelong physical changes. His major work is The Rape of the Lock, and disregarding the title, rape means to steal, and lock as in a lock of hair. So basically it's about cutting someone's hair. It's a mock epic poem meant to smooth over a real life social feud. And so in real life, a young man cut a young woman's lock of hair without her permission. The two families became estranged, and a mutual friend suggested that Pope could heal the rift by composing a comic poem about the incident, to hopefully laugh them out of their hostility. The strategy was limited on practical success, since what good had been achieved was afterwards compromised by the poem's publication. His language, Pope's language, was regarded by the Romantics at the end of the century as consciously poetic and artificial, and the Romantics are who are going to bleed into the Victorians. But they thought it was consciously poetic and artificial, arising partly from his use of archaisms, so older language, partly from his Latinism, and partly from the inflation which plays a comic role in The Rape of the Lock itself. So, and those are just kind of our big figures: Shakespeare, Milton, and Pope. I know this was a lot of information. I hope it was useful. There's no way I could do the early modern period justice in a week. I don't know if you guys know this, but in some schools there are courses on Shakespeare, courses on Milton, courses on Pope alone, just those writers. And 16 weeks isn't enough to cover anything. I don't feel like 16 weeks is also enough to cover 300 years, but we're trying. I encourage you all to read and reread the chapter for this week, which is chapter 4. Read and reread that. And if you have any questions, please email me. If you want me to do a lecture on something else, let me know. Have a great day.